You're listening to The Broken Truth, the podcast where we peel back layers of history, conspiracy, and secrecy. I'm your host, Garrett. Each week, we dig into the stories the headlines forgot, or the government hoped you'd never find. Some of what you'll hear comes straight from declassified files, congressional hearings, and eyewitness accounts. Other pieces live in the shadows, questions with no easy answers. Our goal isn't to tell you what to believe. It's to hand you the fragments of truth, broken as they are, and let you decide what picture they form. So get ready, because tonight's story is one of the darkest chapters in America's hidden history. Picture this: New York City, November 1953, the Statler Hotel, room 1018A. Inside is a man named Frank Olson. He's restless. He's a government scientist, a family man, and lately he's been unraveling. Just a week earlier, at a retreat in the woods of Maryland, Olson had been given a drink by his colleagues. What he didn't know was that inside that glass was a heavy dose of LSD. It was slipped in by his own boss in the CIA. And since then, he's been paranoid, distraught. He told his wife he wanted to resign. He said he felt like he'd seen things he should not have seen, and he wasn't sure who he could trust anymore. And then, in the early hours of November 28th, Olson crashes through a hotel window and falls 13 stories to his death on the sidewalk below. The official explanation is suicide, and the case was closed. But decades later, forensic experts would uncover evidence that Olson had blunt force trauma to his head before he went out that window. His family believes he was murdered, silenced because he knew too much about a secret program the CIA was desperate to keep buried. That program was called MKUltra. And it wasn't science fiction. It wasn't paranoia. It was real. And it was paid for with taxpayer dollars. Tonight, we're peeling back the layers of one of the most infamous government experiments in American history: the CIA's attempt to control the human mind. To understand MKUltra, you have to understand the time period. The early 1950s were a time of panic for American intelligence agencies. The Korean War had shaken Washington. Prisoners of war came home spouting communist propaganda. Some confessed to crimes they almost certainly hadn't committed. The media ran with headlines about this quote-unquote brainwashing. The CIA believed, or at least convinced themselves, that the Soviets and the Chinese had developed methods to reprogram human beings. If America didn't act fast, they feared they'd be behind in a new arms race, not for missiles or bombs, but for minds. So CIA Director Alan Dulles approved a new program in 1953. He placed it under the technical services staff, led by a man named Sidney Gottlieb, a chemist, quiet but ruthless in pursuit of results. He had already been experimenting with poisons and drugs for covert assassinations. Now he had free rein to explore something far bigger. This program was given the cryptonym MKUltra. The MK stood for mind control, borrowing the K from German spelling, a nod to Nazi scientists whose experiments in concentration camps were secretly studied by U.S. intelligence after World War II. And MKUltra wasn't one lab in a basement. It was a web, more than 150 sub-projects spread across universities, hospitals, prisons, and military facilities. Some researchers knew they were taking CIA money, and others didn't. Some thought they were doing legitimate psychiatric research, never realizing their studies were tied to an intelligence operation. In short, MKUltra's mission was simple: to find a way to break a human being and build them back up in whatever shape the CIA wanted. So how do you control a mind? The CIA tried almost everything. First came the drugs, and LSD was the golden child. Gottlieb believed it could be a truth serum, a mind opener, a way to shatter the ego so interrogators could pick up the pieces. Agents dosed soldiers, prisoners, psychiatric patients, even fellow CIA employees, often without warning. In San Francisco and New York, the CIA set up safehouses under a project called Operation Midnight Climax. Prostitutes were hired to lure unsuspecting men inside. Drinks were spiked, and agents sat behind one-way mirrors taking notes while their subjects stumbled through hallucinations. But MKUltra didn't stop with LSD. They experimented with mescaline, psilocybin, amphetamines, barbiturates, and sometimes mixing drugs together to create disorientation. They tested sensory deprivation, placing patients in tanks of warm water for hours, even days, to see how the mind unraveled in isolation. They used hypnosis, attempting to implant suggestions or even induce false memories. And then there was electroshock. At the Allen Memorial Institute in Montreal, psychiatrist Dr. Ewen Cameron received CIA funding to carry out what he called deep patterning. Patients would be blasted with massive doses of electroconvulsive therapy, far beyond normal psychiatric use. Combined with drug-induced sleep and endless recordings of repeated messages, Cameron believed he could wipe the slate of a human personality and reprogram it from scratch. The reality is that it left patients unable to recognize their families, unable to care for themselves, trapped in a childlike state for the rest of their lives. Some forgot entire decades of their lives. And here's the darkest part. Many of these people never consented. They didn't even know they were part of an experiment. They came in for help with depression or anxiety, something that many people continue to struggle with today, if not most people. And instead, they became subjects in a Cold War nightmare. Let's come back to Frank Olson. His death was the first major crack in MKUltra's wall of secrecy. His family spent decades fighting for answers. In 1975, President Gerald Ford even invited them to the White House to apologize. The first time a U.S. president had admitted to a CIA program gone wrong. But the apology did not heal the wounds. Olson's son later had his father's body exhumed, discovering evidence of foul play. To this day, the case is unresolved. Then there were the Canadian patients under Dr. Cameron. One woman checked in for postpartum depression. She left with no memory of her husband or her children. Others spent the rest of their lives in institutions. Their families only learned decades later that the funding had come in from the CIA. Some received settlements, but many never did. There were prisoners too. At federal penitentiaries, inmates were offered reduced sentences if they volunteered for drug experiments. They were given LSD in massive doses, sometimes daily for weeks. One prisoner described feeling like his mind had been split into pieces that never came back together. These are not just numbers in a file. These are people whose lives were stolen in the name of national security. In 1973, as the Watergate scandal threatened to expose the CIA's darker corners, Sidney Gottlieb quietly ordered that all MKUltra files be destroyed. Truckloads of documents gone. What we know today comes from about 20,000 pages of financial records that survived by accident in an accounting office. But even those scraps were enough to shock the nation. In 1975, the Rockefeller Commission uncovered details of the CIA's domestic abuses. Then came the Church Committee in the Senate. The testimony revealed how deep the experiments had gone. In 1977, the Senate held a public hearing on MKUltra. Senators spoke with outrage as victims shared their stories. One senator remarked, quote, "We may never learn the full extent of this program. What we have uncovered is only the tip of the iceberg." The CIA admitted to dosing unwitting citizens. It admitted to funding experiments at universities without disclosure. But it denied many of the worst allegations, and with so many files destroyed, proof was elusive. Some families, like the Olsons, received settlements. A few Canadian patients won compensation years later, but most victims were left with nothing. And no one inside the CIA was ever prosecuted. So what do we still not know? Quite a lot, actually. We don't know how many people were actually subjected to experiments. We don't know all the universities and hospitals that took CIA money, and we also don't know how far the research actually went. Because so many files were destroyed, we may never know. But here's why MKUltra matters today. It reminds us how fragile ethics can be when secrecy and fear take control. The CIA convinced itself these experiments were necessary to protect the nation. In the process, they trampled on human dignity, medical ethics, and basic freedom. And while MKUltra officially ended in the 1960s, the question lingers. If they were willing to drug civilians in bars in the 50s, what are agencies doing now? With modern technology, with AI, with digital surveillance. MKUltra is not just a Cold War story. It's a warning. Because the tools may change, but the temptation to control never really goes away. MKUltra shows us the shadow side of government power. It's not about conspiracy theories. It's about documented history, congressional hearings, and the lives of people who never had a choice. When the government hides behind this curtain of secrecy, accountability vanishes. Victims become footnotes, and justice is almost impossible. But the more we dig, the more we talk about it, the harder it is for those secrets to stay buried. Thanks for listening to The Broken Truth. In our show notes, you'll find links to the declassified CIA documents, the 1977 Senate hearings, and books like The Search for the Manchurian Candidate by John Marks and Acid Dreams by Martin Lee. Dive in for yourself. And if you want to keep exploring with us, head over to our website, sign up for our email list, and join the conversation on our social media by sending us a direct message. We want to hear what you think, because at the end of the day, the truth may be broken, but it's still out there.